The first thing anyone noticed about Marcus Cole was his stillness. At 6'4", standing sentinel outside the royal residence in his scarlet tunic and bearskin cap, he had learned to exist as furniture. Not because he was treated that way, but because the job demanded it. A Buckingham Palace guard does not scratch an itch, does not blink when tourists scream, does not, under any circumstances, break character. Today, the crowds were thick. American families, German school groups, Japanese newlyweds, all pressing against the barriers, phones raised. Marcus kept his eyes fixed forward, the plumed cap heavy against the September humidity. He could feel sweat tracing slow paths down his spine, but his breathing remained measured. 4 years of ceremonial duty had taught him that the body could be trained to ignore almost anything. A young boy waved frantically from his father's shoulders. Marcus didn't react. The boy's face fell, and Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. He'd been that boy once, in Ohio, watching a changing of the guard on a grainy television. He'd believed then that the men in those uniforms were something more than human. Now he knew they were just men who had learned to pretend exceptionally well. His shift was scheduled to end at 4 o'clock. 2 more hours of this. 2 more hours of standing in this exact spot while the world orbited around him, oblivious to his existence. It was a strange kind of invisibility, he thought, to be the most visible man on the parade ground, yet utterly unseen. He remembered his grandmother telling him when he first joined that there was honor in being overlooked. People don't notice the things that work properly, she'd said. They only notice when something breaks. She had worked 42 years at a canning factory in Middletown, her hands scarred from machinery, and she had understood something about service that Marcus was only beginning to grasp. The crowd shifted. A group of American tourists had gathered near the barrier to his left, their voices carrying in that distinct Midwestern accent he hadn't realized he'd lost until he returned home on leave, and found himself sounding like a stranger in his own country. One of them, a man in his early 30s wearing a Cincinnati Reds cap backward, was gesturing toward Marcus with the kind of casual entitlement that money and proximity to power seemed to breed. "This is nothing," the man said, loud enough for Marcus to hear. My brother-in-law works private security in Manhattan. Actually carries a weapon. These guys are just for show." Marcus didn't move, didn't even allow himself the satisfaction of a tightened jaw. The man's companion, a woman in oversized sunglasses, laughed and aimed her phone at him. "Smile for the camera, soldier boy," she called out. He didn't smile. Couldn't. But something shifted in his peripheral awareness. He noted their positions, their clothing, their body language. Old habits. The ones they drilled into him during training, before he'd ever put on this uniform, before he'd learned to stand still. The thing about stillness was that it wasn't passive. It was the opposite of passive. Every moment of immobility was an active choice, a refusal to react, a discipline carved into muscle memory. As Marcus had spent 6 months learning to feint properly, to recognize the warning signs and execute the approved collapse without injuring himself or compromising his weapon. He had memorized the exact dimensions of his post, the precise angle of his stance, the specific weight distribution required to maintain that stance for hours. None of these people knew any of that. Why would they? The uniform was designed to obscure, not reveal. It transformed a man into an idea, and ideas were easy to dismiss. The man in the Reds cap was still talking, his voice carrying over the ambient noise of the crowd. "I'm just saying, it's all theater. Dress them up, give them a prop gun, and call it tradition. Back home, we'd call this cosplay." Marcus felt the familiar heat rise in his chest. He had felt this heat before, in Afghanistan. Yet when a convoy had been hit, and he'd watched friends bleed out on sand that soaked up blood like it was nothing. He had felt it in the hospital during the long months of recovery when the doctors told him he'd never carry a rucksack again. He had felt it when he'd been offered this position, this ceremonial role, and had to swallow the bitter truth that his combat career was over. But he had also learned in those months of rehabilitation that heat was a choice. Anger was a choice. And he had chosen deliberately and with full awareness to let the heat pass through him without catching. So he stood, and the crowd flowed around him, and the man kept talking, unaware that the furniture was listening. The confrontation began, as most things do, with a shift in proximity. And the man in the Reds cap had grown bored with photographing the architecture and had drifted closer to the barrier, his eyes fixed on Marcus with an expression that was neither admiration nor curiosity, but something more corrosive. It was the look of a man who had decided, without evidence, that he was superior to what he saw before him. Marcus recognized this look. He had seen it in officers who had never served, politicians who had never bled, commentators who had never risked anything beyond their own reputations. It was the look of someone who had mistaken comfort for wisdom and safety for virtue. "Hey," the man called out. "Hey, you, in the big hat." Marcus did not respond. His breathing continued its measured rhythm. In 4-4, hold 4-4, out 4-4. The parasympathetic response, they called it. A physiological trick to override the amygdala's insistent demand for fight or flight. "I'm talking to you, soldier. Marine. Whatever you are." The man's tone had shifted, the casual dismissiveness hardening into something more pointed. His companions had gone quiet, sensing a scene in the making. A security officer near the barrier shifted his weight, alert to the changing dynamic. Marcus caught the movement in his periphery and offered the barest micro-nod, a gesture invisible to the civilians but clear to the trained professional. Not yet. Not unless it escalates. The man stepped closer, pressing against the barrier now. His face was flushed, whether from the heat or from something else. Marcus couldn't tell. "You know what I think, eh?" he said, loud enough for the nearby tourists to hear. "I think you're a fraud. You and that little toy gun. You've never done anything real in your life." The words hung in the humid air. Marcus felt them land, one after another, each a small detonation in the controlled landscape of his composure. He thought of Kandahar province, of the compound walls that had seemed to breathe with the heat of incoming fire. He thought of Specialist Rivera, 19 years old, who had died in his arms while asking for his mother. He thought of the Purple Heart in his footlocker, polished monthly, never displayed. He thought of his grandmother who had told him that some people need to diminish others because their own lives feel small. "It's not about you," she'd said. "It's about what you represent to them. You're standing still while they're running in circles. That frightens people." The man was not finished. And emboldened by Marcus's silence, by the lack of any visible reaction, he pushed further. "You don't deserve that uniform. You don't deserve that gun. You're just a prop in a theme park." Something shifted in the crowd. The ambient noise had died down, replaced by the particular quality of silence that precedes either violence or revelation. People were watching now, phones raised, capturing the moment for whatever audience would consume it later. Marcus could see himself through their eyes, the stoic guard, the aggressive tourist, and understood that he was already being reduced to a character in a story he had not chosen. But stories he had learned could be reclaimed. Narratives could be redirected. And silence, when wielded with precision, could be the loudest statement of all. He did not move, did not speak, did not, by any external measure, react at all. But something changed in the quality of his presence. His posture, already rigid, seemed to draw tighter. His focus, already absolute, seemed to intensify. It was not a response the man could articulate, but it was one he could feel. The same way a child feels the weight of a parent's disappointment, the same way a soldier feels the approach of an unseen enemy. The man faltered. His mouth opened, then closed. He took a half-step back from the barrier, suddenly uncertain. His companions exchanged glances, their phones still raised, but their enthusiasm visibly diminished. And then, without breaking his 1,000-yard stare, Marcus spoke. His voice was quiet, calibrated to carry no further than the man at the barrier. And it was the voice of someone who had learned to communicate in environments where noise meant death. "I served in Helmand Province," he said. "I held a 19-year-old boy while he died because the man who was supposed to have our backs was already dead. I carry shrapnel in my left thigh, and memories I will never be able to unsee. And I stand here, in this uniform, because my country asked me to. Your country asked me to." The man's face had gone pale. His companions had lowered their phones. The silence around them had deepened, become something almost solid. "This uniform," Marcus continued, still without visible emotion, "represents the only thing I have ever wanted to be. It represents every man and woman who ever stood a post, who ever fired a weapon in defense of others. Whoever gave their last breath in service to something larger than themselves. It is not a costume, and I am not a prop." He paused. Somewhere behind him, a clock tower began to chime the hour. 4 o'clock. His relief was approaching, but he did not break his stance, did not allow his focus to waver. "You don't have to understand what that means," he said. "You don't have to respect it. But you will not stand here and mock what you cannot comprehend. Not while I am wearing this uniform. Not while I am standing this post." The man opened his mouth, closed it again. His hands, hanging loose at his sides, had begun to tremble. Whatever he had expected from this encounter, it was not this. Not the quiet authority of a man who had earned his stillness through fire, and not the measured words of someone who had found his voice, not despite his silence, but because of it. Marcus's relief arrived. A young guardsman named Peterson, who had been watching the confrontation from the edge of the parade ground. He approached with the measured tread of someone who understood that ritual must be maintained, even especially in moments of rupture. The handover was silent, precise, a choreography developed over centuries of practice. Marcus passed his post to Peterson without acknowledging the crowd, without acknowledging the man who still stood frozen at the barrier, without acknowledging anything except the duty that was ending and the duty that was beginning. And then he walked away. The man watched him go. His companions were already dispersing, suddenly interested in other corners of the parade ground, the other monuments, other souvenirs. One of them tugged at his sleeve, murmured something about getting dinner, about beating the crowds. He did not respond. He was still standing there, alone now, when the clock tower finished chiming the hour. The walk to the guard room was 47 paces. Marcus had counted them 1,000 times, in every season, in every weather. 47 paces to transition from one version of himself to another. 47 paces to unclench the jaw, release the shoulders. Breathe in the way civilians breathed. 47 paces to become, once again, a man named Marcus Cole, who happened to wear a uniform rather than a uniform that happened to be worn by Marcus Cole. Today, those 47 paces felt different. The adrenaline was still fading from his system, leaving behind that peculiar emptiness that follows intense focus. His hands, which had remained perfectly still throughout the confrontation, now trembled slightly as he unbuttoned the tunic. The bearskin cap, when he lifted it from his head, weighed more than it had that morning. Peterson had followed him in, his own shift not yet begun. The younger man stood at the doorway, radiating the particular discomfort of someone who has witnessed something intimate without permission. "Sir," he said, "that man, outside. Should I—" "No," Marcus said. "He's not our concern." Peterson hesitated. He was 22 years old, fresh from training, still carrying the eager earnestness that Marcus recognized from his own younger self. He had not yet learned that some battles were won through absence rather than presence, and that sometimes the most powerful response was no response at all. "He was wrong, sir. What he said, it wasn't right." Marcus looked at him, really looked, in a way he rarely allowed himself to look at the younger guardsman under his informal mentorship. Peterson's face was flushed, his jaw set in that particular configuration of righteous indignation that youth specialized in. He wanted justice, or at least acknowledgement. He wanted the record set straight. "He was wrong," Marcus agreed. "But that's not the point." "What is the point, sir?" The question hung between them. Marcus considered his response carefully, the way he had learned to consider all responses now. Words, once spoken, could not be unspoken. Truths, once revealed, could not be concealed again. He had spent years learning to be silent, and only recently had he begun to understand when silence was no longer sufficient. "The point," he said slowly, "is that he said what he believed, and I responded with what I know. Whether he changes his belief is not my concern. Whether you or anyone else thinks I was right is not my concern. My only concern was to stand my post with integrity. That's what I did." Peterson absorbed this. His posture shifted slightly, the righteous indignation giving way to something more contemplative. "Sir," he said, "can I ask you something? About Afghanistan?" Marcus nodded. He had learned in the months since his return that the questions would always come. The young ones especially needed to understand. Not the mechanics of combat, which they would learn soon enough, but the meaning of it. The why that underlay the how. "Did you ever think about quitting?" Peterson asked. "After you were wounded. Did you ever think about just walking away?" It was a question Marcus had asked himself many times, in the dark hours when sleep would not come and the memories pressed close. He had considered it. Yes. Had even drafted a letter of resignation, its formal language carefully calibrated to express gratitude while concealing shame. He had imagined a different life. Civilian clothes, civilian work, the comfortable anonymity of someone who had never worn a uniform at all. "Every day," he said, "for months, I thought about what it would mean to be normal, to not have to carry this." He gestured vaguely at the tunic hanging on its hook, at the cap resting on the shelf, at the weight of history and expectation that clung to both. To just be Marcus from Ohio, who worked in an office somewhere and came home at 5 o'clock and never thought about why he was doing any of it. "What stopped you?" Marcus considered the question. He thought of his grandmother, who had never understood his decision to enlist, but had supported it anyway. Sending care packages filled with homemade cookies that always arrived crumbled. He thought of Specialist Rivera, who had joined the Army because it was the only way he could afford college, who had died with his mother's name on his lips. He thought of the man at the barrier, who would never know the weight of what he had mocked, who would return to his comfortable life believing that he had faced a soldier and won. "I realized," Marcus said, "that walking away wouldn't make me normal. It would just make me a soldier who wasn't a soldier anymore. The uniform isn't something you put on. It's something you become. And once you've become it, You can't unbecome it. You can only decide what kind of soldier you're going to be. The guard room was quiet. Outside, the city continued its indifferent rhythm. Tourists photographing monuments, buses discharging passengers, street vendors hawking Union Jack flags and commemorative tea towels. Inside, two men in various states of undress contemplated the nature of service and the cost of integrity. Peterson broke the silence first. "Sir," he said, "that man, he called you a fraud. But you didn't get angry. You didn't even raise your voice. How did you do that?" Marcus smiled, a rare expression that transformed his severe features into something almost gentle. "I've had a lot of practice," he said, "and I've learned that anger is a luxury. It feels good in the moment, but it doesn't accomplish anything. It doesn't change minds. It doesn't heal wounds. It just creates more of the same." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "That man outside, he's not my enemy. He's not even really my antagonist. He's just someone who has never been required to examine his own assumptions. And maybe, after today, he will. Maybe he won't. But either way, I've done what I can. The rest is up to him." Peterson nodded slowly. He was young enough to find this philosophy unsatisfying, old enough to recognize its wisdom. "I hope he does," he said. "Examine his assumptions, I mean. I hope he thinks about what you said." "He will," Marcus said. "Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow. But at some point, when he's lying awake at 3 in the morning, replaying the conversation in his head, he'll think about it, and that's enough." The guardroom door opened, admitting a rush of afternoon noise and 2 more guardsmen coming off shift. The mundane reality of the changing schedule reasserted itself, lockers opening and closing, equipment being checked and signed over. The casual banter of men who worked together and therefore knew each other in ways that required no explanation. Marcus retreated into this familiarity, his moment of revelation receding into the background. But something had changed. He could feel it in the way the other guardsmen looked at him, their respect deepened by whatever Peterson had shared. He could feel it in his own posture, which had shifted from the rigid discipline of the parade ground to something more settled, more integrated. He had spoken his truth, not in anger, but in clarity. And he had defended not just his uniform, but his understanding of what that uniform meant. And he had done it without breaking, without compromising, without becoming the thing that the man at the barrier had accused him of being. That night, in his small flat in Pimlico, Marcus sat at his kitchen table with a notebook open before him. He had not written in this notebook since his rehabilitation, when a therapist had suggested journaling as a way to process trauma. He had filled exactly 3 pages before abandoning the practice, finding that words were insufficient to contain the weight of what he carried. But tonight, words came. He wrote about Specialist Rivera, about the heat and dust and sound of Kandahar. He wrote about the hospital, the slow relearning of basic movements, the humiliation of dependence. He wrote about the uniform, at which he had initially accepted as a consolation prize and had gradually come to understand as its own kind of honor. And he wrote about the man at the barrier, not with anger, not even with resentment, just with acknowledgement. A man had spoken words of dismissal, and another man had responded with words of truth. It was not a victory or a defeat. It was just an exchange between 2 people who would never see each other again, an interaction that would fade into memory and, eventually, be forgotten entirely. But maybe not entirely. Maybe something would linger. Maybe the man would tell his children about the soldier who stood still and spoke quietly and somehow made him feel smaller than he had ever felt before. Maybe he would think twice before mocking another uniform, another symbol, another person whose interior life he could not see. Maybe and maybe that was enough. Marcus closed the notebook and placed it in the drawer beside his bed, next to the Purple Heart he never displayed and the photograph of his grandmother he looked at every night before sleeping. Tomorrow, he would put on the uniform again. He would stand his post, still and silent, while tourists photographed him and children waved and the indifferent world continued its rotation. He would be furniture, visible and invisible, a man transformed into an idea. But he would know, as he had always known, that the idea was real, that the uniform contained a man who had earned his stillness. That silence, when chosen rather than imposed, was the loudest declaration of all. And when the man at the barrier eventually woke at 3 in the morning, that replaying the conversation in his head, he would hear Marcus's voice, quiet, measured, unshakable, and understand that he had encountered something he could not dismiss. That was enough. That had always been enough. The weeks passed. Autumn arrived in London, stripping leaves from the plane trees along the parade ground and replacing the summer tourists with autumn tourists, equally numerous but better dressed against the cold. Marcus stood his post, as he had always stood his post, and the rhythm of his days resumed its familiar cadence. Wake, train, travel to the palace, stand, travel home, eat, sleep, repeat. But something had shifted, almost imperceptibly. The other guardsmen had begun to treat him differently, not with the formal deference due to seniority, but with something warmer, more personal. Peterson had taken to seeking him out during breaks, asking questions about Afghanistan and training and the peculiar discipline of ceremonial duty. Other young guardsmen followed suit, drawn by the quiet authority that Marcus had always possessed but had only recently learned to express. He had become, without intending it, something of a mentor, not through any formal designation, but through the simple accumulation of moments like the one at the barrier, moments when silence proved insufficient and words, carefully chosen, proved powerful. The young men who came to him were seeking not instruction, but confirmation. They wanted to know that the uniform they wore was real, that the service they performed was meaningful, that the stillness they maintained was not weakness, but strength. And Marcus, yes, who had spent years believing that his ceremonial role was a consolation prize, began to understand that it was something else entirely. He was not standing guard over a building. He was standing guard over a tradition, a continuity, a collective memory of service that extended backward through centuries and forward through generations. He was not a prop. He was a link in a chain that would continue after he was gone. The man at the barrier had accused him of being a fraud, but frauds did not inspire young men to examine their own assumptions. Frauds did not stand motionless for hours while carrying the weight of memory and grief and unresolved trauma. Frauds did not transform silence into a weapon and words into a shield. Marcus Cole was many things. He was a soldier, a guardsman, a survivor, and he was the grandson of a canning factory worker and the inheritor of her stubborn integrity. He was a man who had learned to stand still and, in that stillness, had found his purpose. But he was not, and had never been, a fraud. And somewhere, in a city far from London, a man in a Cincinnati Reds cap lay awake at 3 in the morning, replaying a conversation in his head, and wondered if he had been wrong. The clock tower chimed the hour. Marcus took his post. The crowd pressed against the barrier, phones raised, voices lifted in the universal language of tourism. A young boy waved frantically from his father's shoulders. Marcus did not react, but inside, in the private landscape where memory and meaning converged, he smiled.